You come in here with a skull full of mush, and you leave thinking like a lawyer.
Yes, I found a flaw in the model that I perceive is the critical functioning structure that defines how the world works, so to speak.
You know, the point of a democracy is that we're sovereign citizens and we can decide how much of our life we want the government to be involved in. And so the broader question is this 24/7 surveillance, which hasn't really helped the problem that we have installed it to deal with, is that worth whatever safety it's supposed to be providing, and is it really providing any of that safety? Like, I don't think I feel particularly safer because, you know, if a cop that pulled me over happens to have a body camera on their chest versus not.
Hi everyone, this is John Hanson from the Systemic Justice Project and the Flaw magazine at Harvard Law School. Police body cameras were supposed to bring accountability. They were supposed to be a check on power, a way to capture the truth. But in practice, they've become something else, a tool for law enforcement to control the narrative, a lucrative industry for private corporations, and yet another piece of a growing surveillance state. In this episode of Flaw School, hosts Sean Moon and Sam Perry sit down with Priya, a third-year law student, to explore the uneasy reality of body cameras. They trace how Axon, the company that dominates this industry, has turned calls for reform into a business model. They explore how footage is manipulated, blurred, cut, and reframed to justify police violence rather than expose it. And they examine why, despite the proliferation of body cameras, police killings continue to rise. Are body cameras holding police accountable? Or are they simply reshaping public perception to legitimate the status quo? Welcome to Flaw School, the podcast about the flaws in the law.
Hey, welcome to Flaw School, a podcast that explores the flaws in our legal system. I'm one of today's hosts, Sean Moon, and I'm a second year at Harvard College.
Hi everyone, I'm Sam Perry, and I'm a public defender, and I am the co-host to this episode.
And we're so excited to be hosting today's episode of Flaw School.
Every 2 weeks, we interview law students to uncover the role of corporate actors in producing many of our most urgent social problems and the troubling tale of corporate actors shaping, bending, capturing, and breaking the law in their favor. In this episode, we'll be discussing the intersection between police body camera footage, police brutality, and the surveillance state.
Today, we're joined by Priya, a third-year law student. Welcome to Flaw School, Priya. Class is in session.
Priya, this is such a fascinating, disturbing, and interesting topic to me. What inspired you to write about it?
Hi, Sam and Sean. Thank you for having me on. This topic was an extension of some work I did during an internship about tasers, actually. I knew that Axon was the company that produced tasers, and I got curious about what other stuff that they produced, saw that they did body camera work, and fell down a rabbit hole of looking at the responses to police brutality by buying body cameras for police departments. And I just got really curious about, whether or not they worked, whether or not they actually did what they were advertised to do and what the public thought about them overall. So from that came this article where I uncovered a lot more than I expected to.
I want to take us a little deeper into your article, Priya. So you open this article with a sense of hope. After the murder of George Floyd, people were demanding justice. But in time, this momentum seemed to fizzle. Then in February 2021, Davrian Kennard was murdered by a police officer. And there's a screenshot in your article of the body cam footage of the murder, which you tell us was edited by the police and then shared with the public 6 months later. Could you talk us through the significance of that release and the call for transparency that followed?
Sure. So some of the significance of this event was just that it was honestly routine at this point, which was disappointing given the protests we saw around the murder of George Floyd. Police departments routinely will edit body camera footage and release it as they did in this case with kind of a PowerPoint presentation accompanying it and police commentary attached to it that really changes the way that you view the footage. So the footage on its own kind of shows a rushed chase, and a horrific shooting that the police blur out and mute to kind of tone down some of the gore. And after this was released, Mr. Kennard's family asked the police department for more footage, for information about what really happened. They felt like justice was not done. And this is a story that happens over and over again throughout the country with these kinds of encounters. And it shows the broader problem with body cameras, which is the idea is that they capture footage, which is supposed to be um, just pure information that doesn't have an angle. But the problem is that information can then be edited. And if the police are controlling how it's released, it doesn't necessarily do what it's supposed to do. As I mentioned in the article, the officer that shot Mr. Kennard was still on the force, as far as I could tell. I think took some time off to recover from the incident, but there weren't really any punishments. And as I mentioned later on in the article, this exposure of body camera footage through these edited releases and highly propagandized commentary doesn't really change anything. The number of police encounters that end in deaths with civilians has only increased over time.
I have a question, because I know in your article you mentioned, right, different ways that they edit body camera footage. And I know, right, with like the release of the footage specific to Mr. Kennard, like, yes, like blurred out parts, like muted parts. But I think another way is like body camera images and footage can be edited that's not so clearly like in your face, right? That it's blurred out. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that too, because I do think it is relevant and kind of maybe would help people understand different ways it could be edited more than just like these blatant ways when it's released, because there are definitely more forms of editing.
Sure. So the different types of editing that can occur, and I'm not, a videography expert or anything, but the police can change the order in which you see the footage. They can change in selecting the footage from, different police officers' cameras and splicing it together. They can tell a story. Even if we take the underlying belief that video footage is never going to tell a lie because it's just capturing what is objectively happening, the way that it is edited together can tell a completely different story. I referenced the New York Times article in my piece that shows that because of the way that cameras are worn on an officer's chest, they can make encounters that are completely benign seem incredibly dangerous. One of the examples in the article is like a police officer dancing and a suspect also dancing, and it looks like they are in a fight or in a chase. Like it seems like danger is happening. So that's one way that the police can, make it seem like force was justified because it was a very dangerous situation. In other instances, it's just the order in which the events are presented. Like also just the low grain of the footage. These aren't great cameras. In the specific video of Mr. Kennard, it is very hard to tell that he has nothing in his hands. It's also hard to tell from that footage, what he was feeling, what the officer was feeling, if it was actually a particularly dangerous situation. And on top of just the footage itself, the way the police present it to the public with additional commentary, when you are primed to think a video is saying or showing something, that is what you kind of expect to see. And so your own biases will like put a filter between you and the evidence. So there's lots of different ways that police department can change the story or create their own narrative through footage that we are kind of trained to believe is going to be perfectly truthful.
That's super helpful. Um, and I also now want to talk like a little bit more specifically, right, about the company that is monopolizing the body camera market, right? And that's Axon. So right, there's these calls for justice, these demands for justice, and police departments respond to these calls with the help of the Axon Corporation. Like, sure, we'll record everything. And Axon's like, sure, we'll make an insane amount of money off of this. I know you spoke briefly about Axon and kind of how you were drawn to read up more about them from your experience and also from like looking into tasers, but I'm hoping you could tell us a little bit more about that company.
Yeah, so Axon is a kind of technology and security company. It did start out manufacturing tasers. It was previously known as Taser International. It changed its name after the taser got a bunch of bad press for not actually being non-lethal. So, in its initial version, Axon sold tasers. It identified them as a non lethal way of stopping dangerous encounters with police, between police and civilians. And the company had this entire like branding story around its existence and its product. The idea was to make both policing safer and interacting with police safer for communities. And as it kind of grew into a larger technology-based corporation, um, it kept that narrative going. And it seems with kind of no acknowledgement of, the danger that tasers actually present. And as they started getting into the body camera market, also the lack of effects of body cameras on police brutality, really. And it does all of this with this really like perky kind of advertising um, scheme. It's very optimistic, it's very positive. It's like we are friends to police departments, but we really want to help you not hurt people. And like on its front page, it's got um, this like updating number that talks about the number of lives that the taser has saved. I looked through that link to try to see how they got that information. Very unclear. Nowhere in that report that it linked was that number stated. Um, so yeah, and it has all of these goals for itself. It has a moonshot program where it wants to end any deaths, any police killings. Unclear how exactly it's working to do that. And its most recent venture now is kind of connecting the footage that comes out of body cameras and doorbell cameras and just normal CCTV surveillance footage in like shops and restaurants into creating this like surveillance map that police departments can use as like rapid crime response centers and tagging that with an AI company that they have acquired to sift through that data and see where crimes are happening. So it's this very like eerie, in my opinion, it's a very eerie like police state developing company that is trying to hide itself in this guise of trying to protect people from police encounters without really digging in deeper to why these encounters happen or um, why what their products are really doing. As I mentioned, like tasers don't have a great track record. They sometimes kill people because it's not great to be electrically charged with thousands of volts of energy. So yeah, it's definitely, as I mentioned in the article, it's a bit of a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Yeah, definitely. And like you just said, Axon kind of presents itself as a champion of police accountability while simultaneously strengthening its ties with the government. And this ultimately allows Axon to profit from both public outrage and government investment. What do you think are the broader implications of this strategy and branding?
So I think that for as long as Axon remains a primarily police security and technology company, its ability to spin police violence and police brutality into problems that can be solved with silver bullet solutions that are their products, it will just continue to make money. I can't speak for the company, obviously, but the problems with American policing are deep and very complicated, and they can't be solved with like a neat piece of tech or an AI that can go through lots of images and videos. And but the problem is because it presents itself as such an easy solution a and it presents itself not as like a weapons manufacturer, even though it is, um, it will continue to be, like the first person to call for improving in quotes, these police civilian encounters and to try to decrease the damage done by police departments to the communities they serve. So, what ends up happening is this just kind of endless cycle, I think, where we have a problem of police brutality. Axon says, here is a solution on a silver platter. The problem continues, and Axon just says, well, you haven't equipped enough police departments with body cameras, or, oh, well, what you need is this AI system to really analyze this evidence better, and then you can police better, and you're not wasting your time on people who aren't actually committing crimes. Or you need to buy more tasers, or this new version of a taser that is less lethal. And they keep raking in money, and the problem doesn't really get any better because it's not even scratching the surface uh, of the roots of the issue itself.
I just want to make clear what I think is bubbling under the surface and kind of get your thoughts on it. The rise of body camera footage is a tool being used to justify the brutal and murderous criminal legal system and the actors that serve it. It sort of ties to the concept of system justification. The system adapts in response to threats to its legitimacy. So if people think the police and the criminal legal system are so twisted and just so hopeless, they have no trust in those institutions, they might just toss them to the curb. And those institutions will keep adapting, like you said, right? With new technologies. Oh, we need to use artificial intelligence, that will help us make better use of these technologies. We need to arm more officers with body camera footage, and then the truth will be shared with the world. And it feels like in our conversation and in reading your article that you'd agree with this perspective. But I know that, as a public defender, a very specific view on body camera footage. And I'm curious if, this perspective resonates with you, or you feel like maybe it's just not so black and white, Sam, and there are some nuances to it.
I'm pretty similarly of that bent as well. I think that you're right. I think when there are general uprisings to the system wants to survive because there are powerful people that benefit from it. And this particular threat to its legitimacy is, of the flavor of police are unreasonably hurting and killing people. And so I don't have trust in them as an institution. And so the police say, well, we can show you what we're actually facing out there. And then that way you have a perfect record of what happened because we're wearing the cameras on our chests, and uh, you can see for yourself what we're dealing with and that our actions are completely legitimate. And yes, that child did look like a grown up, and that toy gun did seem dangerous. Um, and it's this weird solution of like bringing you into their lives and putting you in their positions so you feel for them, and then you as in like the American people give the system legitimacy again because you think, looking at this footage, oh, this was a hard choice, or it makes sense that this police officer was scared and felt like they needed to respond to this. Um, which, and like I, as someone who is also not particularly, who's like of a public defense bent, I've watched body camera footage that I have just been very confused by, and like can't keep track of what's happening. And so it's harder in those instances to really look the police directly in the eye and say, what you did was ridiculous and you should not have done it. And that lends it legitimacy. Um, and it's all part of this kind of continuous cycle where people identify a problem, but it is so hard to mobilize a large enough group of people to teach them about a problem, to get them angry about a problem, to get them angry enough that they like call their representatives or go protest. And then when the system can just make these like minor changes and people say, well, it's really hard to fix a problem overnight, at least they're doing something, but the something that they're doing is not necessarily actually helpful. It's just really well advertised and spun as helpful. So yeah, I definitely agree with the idea that this is just continued system justification.
And I also just like hearing you say all that, it made me think too, right? Like, this is idea of like the benefits of body camera footage also just like ignores some realities, right? Like, if an officer doesn't turn the footage on, nothing's recorded. And at least like, I mean, I get Axon footage all the time and they have to press the button and to turn it on. When it turns on, it rewinds 30 seconds back. So it's kind of technically always running, but like it's not recording unless you press the button. And so even like I have a case right now where the officer says they see this traffic violation, but they don't turn their camera on until after it. And so then they continue to drive past this car for a little bit and then pull them over. And unless this traffic violation actually did happen, right, this is an illegal stop. So, you know, this idea that we can just, oh, like this technology can get better and better, right? It's like, well, this also is in part based on like what are the actors doing with it and how they're using it. I also had another case recently where it's like a serious case and an officer is like making these hand gestures that I feel like this podcast is probably too PG for me to explain what it is, but kind of making light of the situation where you're like, whoa, are we both recognizing what you're here to like quote investigate? And you're just kind of like treating this as a little like fun gig for you. Um, so I think this whole idea also of like this can get better and better. It's like who are the people who are using it and how are they using it? So I just also wanted to, it just felt right to add in there.
Yeah, I think that's fair. A big part, a big issue with the whole, like, yes, we're collecting this body camera footage is that, like, they collect it, but it kind of goes into the black hole of a police department. And then we see, the public sees what the police department wants the public to see. So it ignores a lot of this, frankly, crass to violent, illegal, horrifying behavior by police officers. And we only see the shiny or the relevant or the pieces that make you feel really poorly for these men and women who are theoretically putting their lives on the line to keep communities safe. And with as busy as everyone is, like, no one has time to go digging for all of this or to put in the FOIA requests to to get like the full footage. And even if they did request it, they probably wouldn't get it, all of this stuff. So it's easy to keep people complacent and quiet when everyone is living their own lives and they don't really care about this until it happens to them, and then suddenly, what is one person going to do against an entire system?
I just want to shift gears just a little bit and go from kind of like a edits to the video and the selective nature of how the body cam footages are edited to the biases that the perspective of the body cams itself can provide to the court and the jury. So in your article, you mentioned the camera perspective bias, where the angle, the level, perspective of the camera tends to bias people. So if police are running, for example, it seems chaotic and stressful. It seems like the camera perspective bias would be difficult to attenuate, even if the misleading edits were prevented. Could you tell us a little bit more about this bias and whether anything is being done to mediate its effects?
Sure, yeah. So camera perspective bias, as you mentioned, is just the idea that It kind of stems from the idea when you like put yourself in someone else's shoes or look through their eyes, you have a better understanding of what they're going through. And this happens when you're viewing camera footage from a particular person's perspective. So, as I mentioned earlier, there was that uh, experiment that the New York Times did where the body camera footage of a police officer made it seem like he was in this really intense encounter with a civilian, where when you zoom out to a third person camera that showed both the police officer and just the person he was interacting with, they were both, it was like a dance battle. They were just dancing at each other. So when you get footage from a camera that is placed on officers' chests, which is usually where it is, one, the person, unless the officer is just really tall, like everyone seems so much larger in the footage. And so they seem more dangerous because you're naturally kind of afraid of, people that are larger than you. And because it's on the chest and it's not necessarily strapped on super tightly, it like bounces up and down as the officer moves. So normal innocuous movement, like walking, seems more rushed and chaotic. And it also makes whatever the person is doing um, scarier too. And cameras don't accurately capture our vision either. Like, people talk about like the fish lens effect. It doesn't have, the properties that our brain does to collect information from multiple lenses and make the world look normal. So um, it basically it tells a story through a perspective of like sitting on a police officer's chest that is frankly it is scary. And as I mentioned, if you watch body camera footage, it's like very hard to tell what's happening. In terms of mediating its effects, I would struggle with answering this question or even offering any solutions because I don't think its effects need to be mediated. I think we just need to kind of get rid of body cameras. Like I don't think they do a great job. Um, the one thing I could say about mediating is like basically what was mentioned in the Times article, where if you get a third person perspective that captures fully the scene, so you can see the edges of what's happening instead of being super close up, you can see like a limb or two, and it seems bouncy and chaotic. If you're looking from further away from a camera that seems more like it's recording an unbiased version of the events, like that could be helpful to deal with the perspective issue. But honestly, that also means, more surveillance. And I am not, to be clear, advocating for like CCTV cameras on every light, light pole or building.
People can't see this, but as we're recording, I put up a reaction of like a clapping hands to what Priya was saying. I do like, I wanted to kind of throw out the naysayer's perspective, and it also did make me think of some things that like, okay, yes, I can give it to body camera footage that, right? Like if officers say one thing and I watch the body camera footage and it says something else, like I can like weaponize that for my client's benefit, right? Like I have a case where um a cop's like looking through this car, and in the report he says there's aluminum foil in the car, and for my training and experience, which is in every single report, like I know that's like, so used to ingest whatever drug they can come up with for that, right? And I watch the footage and there is a full slice of pizza in the foil. So you're like, what? Like did they really think that like you weren't going to see the full like uneaten slice of pizza, right? So like in that moment, I was like, hell yeah. I mean, does it like bust my case open? Absolutely not. But like, it still diminishes their credibility if they're going to write and report that they say that they saw one thing and you see the opposite. Crazy. Love that. But there also like are other things people will say that maybe like I wouldn't necessarily vibe with, but I think a lot of people would probably say who don't, like you were saying, view body camera footage often or see the effects it can have. Like they might say, well, it can serve as like helpful evidence, right? Just like generally speaking, right? The more information we have is always the better. And people who are videoed, they can request the footage, like you're saying, right? And, what we collect in footage now might not be helpful now, but it could be helpful down the road. And like this other case, now we have all this evidence, and like, aren't we glad that we just have more to look at, right? Like the more information people have, they can use it in various ways. And like, is it really worth giving up these benefits by reducing the use or just completely eliminating the use of body camera footage? Because like nothing's going to be perfect. No technology is going to be perfect. Like, isn't it better to have more than less? Like, what would you say to that? I'm curious.
A couple things. I think first, it's a question that makes sense. Um, I feel like we have this basic understanding that more information is better than less. But with the body cameras in particular, I would caution people to first look and see if, like, what benefits is it actually providing? Who does it actually help? What do the kind of numbers and studies about its use done by, neutral parties, not Axon funded scientists, like, what do they actually show? And, we have seen that police killings have not declined. More people are being killed by the police every year. That is not changing. So body cameras aren't changing that. And it's also, body camera footage is also often used by prosecutors, much more than defense lawyers. And, on that front, like, maybe someone has a different bent than I do and they think that's fine. But, and this is the second point, we have to ask ourselves what we're willing to accept in terms of being surveilled by the state. I think every question about safety and dealing with crime, it all comes with a trade-off, right? Like, if you want to be safe, you have to, or at least the government is telling us, if you want to be safe, you have to give up some of your rights for that safety. If you're called into court, you have to go to court. You have to help the system help you. But we're also, the point of a democracy is that we're sovereign citizens and we can decide how much of our life we want the government to be involved in. And so the broader question is this 24/7 surveillance, which hasn't really helped the problem that we have installed it to deal with, um, is that worth whatever safety it's supposed to be providing? And is it really providing any of that safety? Like, I don't think I feel particularly safer because, if a cop that pulled me over happens to have a body camera on their chest versus not. I think that question, you have to answer the deeper question of, like, how much knowledge does the state really deserve to have, or how much information does the state really deserve to have? And then after that, like, what does it really help? I mean, I'm a private person. I think the state doesn't deserve to have that much information about me. And separately from that, we have data that shows it doesn't help. It's not doing what we want it to do. And I don't think prosecutors really need help getting more people in jail.
I also just found myself thinking of this too, right? Is like, if we're thinking about the idea that people should have, as much information related to an investigation or a police interaction as possible, then why are we so freaked out by like civilians pulling out their phone to start recording? Why is it seen as like a threat to police officers for there to be a video from their perspective? Because if we're actually thinking about having the most information and like level playing field, you want both sides, right? And like, I think you're right that body camera footage is often used more by prosecutors. I mean, I would say for me, it's probably more for like impeachment stuff, but like they have the burden of proof. Like I don't have the burden of proof. So if they know less generally, like all the better. But I do think then, if we're going to say that the state has a right to have, you know, all this video footage being captured all the time, then like why is it an issue when civilians do the same thing? Because they feel like officers are often like, oh, like put your phone away, like you're coming closer to me. It's like I'm just lifting this up, I'm just recording this interaction just like you are, and I don't trust that you're going to give me what you've recorded. And maybe if you do, not in a timely fashion, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I think having little cameras that we can carry with us everywhere is a great way for people to be able to counteract police stories. And also you see when comparing cell phone footage with body cam footage, it makes it so, like, the different perspective makes it so clear that what's happening is not as urgent or anything as the police put it out to be, but it is so hard to counter video evidence without video evidence of your own. For the law students in the room, there's the famous, I think it's Scott v. Harris, that the Supreme Court said that um, it's obvious what happened here. We have a video of it. There is no other argument that you could make. Like, no reasonable person would think otherwise, which was very funny in that opinion because there was a dissent of, like, I can't remember if it was 3 or 4 justices, but they clearly thought otherwise. So, yeah, it's this videos seem just so unimpeachable. It seems like they show exactly what happened. They give more information than just a single photograph. But as we talked about earlier, a video can mean a lot of things, and can prove a lot of things from different perspectives.
Yeah, my next question is actually almost directly in line with what you just said about the reality behind videos, but some people might be skeptical that the courts will actually allow these edited body camera footage as evidence, and I just want to ask what you would say to that.
Well, I will say, as a law student, I don't really have a lot of experience with this. So I think, Sam, as a practicing attorney, you might have a better answer to this question.
Okay, yeah, I definitely think that courts do allow edited body camera footage in as evidence. I mean, I will just say more broadly, I think that anything that is evidence, whether it's like photos or videos, honestly, I can go beyond that, but I'll keep it limited to that. I do think that they're edited just by the nature of like they're taking on a specific perspective and they're like coming from a specific point of view. But um, I guess I would think about this in a couple ways. So I had a case where there was video footage. It was dash camera footage, which is pretty similar to body camera footage. A lot of officers who are wearing body camera footage have in their cruiser dash camera footage. Um, and the video was about 2 minutes, and it was the only video that we had of this alleged crime. Um, and it was actually not even coming from a cop car, it was coming from a civilian's car. And that civilian was friends with the alleged victim. Um, and we litigated the issue of whether the footage should be admissible on the grounds that it really is biased. It's a 2 minute clip that was taken out of this constantly running dash cam footage. And that's edited, right? It's like chopped up to the specific portion that was chosen by the civilian who submitted it to the police. They didn't submit the whole night's footage. They just submitted the 2 minutes. And so the state would argue and they did argue that it wasn't edited, right? Like, this is just what we received. But in reality, it is edited, right? Like, it's chopped at a certain point. That even, goes for body camera footage that is of an interview or a conversation with someone who's a witness, whether they're the complaining witness or just a witness to a case, right? Like, what's going to be admitted to court is not going to be the full entire conversation majority of the time, because it would just be too long, and courts are also concerned about efficiency and don't want to keep people there all day. And so the context of the video footage you're getting is, artificial, right? In the sense that they're only going to be admitting a snippet of the footage, and how much you get out of that snippet will really inform the jurors about what they think about the case. So I think, if we're thinking in the sense of like, are courts going to allow video footage that is like blurred? I mean, I think it's a little bit tougher for this state to try to argue that they can blur the footage if they were to try to admit footage that was like zoomed in after the fact. I think that's also a problem in the sense that like someone's supposed to testify that the footage is like an accurate representation and that the camera was like working as normal and that there are no glitches with it. And so if like a footage is skipping, that's an issue, right? Like, how can you say that it's working in normal order? But beyond those kind of, I'm going to say more extreme instances where you'd say like that clearly looks edited or clearly looks messed up, I think a lot of video footage is just inherently biased and edited, because you're not going to admit everything. So people might not think of it as being edited when they're seeing these snippets, but it is edited, and the state has a burden of proof. So they are going to be probably the people who are introducing the footage. Maybe the defense is introducing footage to impeach a witness, or they're just introducing themselves. But it's really, that's a defense, right? Like, it's not the burden. So I do think that courts will definitely allow it edited. It just depends on how you define what is edited. But in my point of view, it is edited.
Yeah, I think it's just as a broader, I guess, comment to this too is I think a lot of people might think the law is a very objective field or like criminal trials are very objective, but so much of like everything is shades of gray. So much of it is subjective. Like there's this joke that, how a judge will rule depends on what they had for breakfast this morning. Like there's a million ways for attorneys to manipulate different types of evidence that don't involve actually changing, like photoshopping anything into the evidence. It's like it's all about how a lawyer presents it and how they have other people talk about it and how they talk about it to a jury or a judge. So it's, and video evidence especially, I think is a very dangerous tool in that tool set.
Yeah, thank you, Sam and Priya, both for answering this question. But also, this lack of objectivity in the law and also how body cam footage can be manipulated. I think some of our listeners are now wondering how they can participate in the call to arms against body cameras. So, do you have any suggestions for where they can go to learn more?
Yeah, I feel like this has been kind of a depressing episode. I would say the first thing I always like to do when I learn something that outrages me is try to get more information. And I think there's a lot of really good resources online about, do body cameras work actually? And um, what do kind of like civil rights groups and anti like surveillance groups think about this? Another great resource that people might want to check out to learn more about police propaganda is a book called Propaganda by Alec Karakatsanis. Um, and in terms of the call to arms against body cameras, this is going to sound like a tired line, but I think, if your town or community is thinking about outfitting your police department with body cameras or updating them or honestly outfitting just the streets with more cameras. I think there's this general understanding in kind of the world of police reform that reforms, and I'm using air quotes right now, that put more money in the pockets of police are generally not doing anything for you. They're simply helping the state police you more effectively. And effectively is not necessarily a good thing. Um, so I think that the thing to do is like talk to your local governments. If it seems like it's something that Congress is dealing with at the moment, call your congressperson, write them a letter, like try to get involved in local government. Um, and if you're in some of the bigger metropolitan areas, I think there's generally groups that work on this. So searching like anti-surveillance or um, I know someone I talked to worked for the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. So there are groups like that maybe they could use volunteers, maybe they could use support. I'm sure they could always use money. So yeah, things like that could be a way to participate.
That's a lot of great advice for our listeners. And that's all we have time for today. Priya, thank you so much for joining us on Flaw School. We're happy to talk body cameras with you any day.
Thanks so much for having me.
And I also want to thank you both for such a wonderful conversation. Um, I could, I think it's clear by this episode that I could talk about this a lot and I have a lot of opinions on things, but it's really great to kind of get both of your perspectives and just kind of like chat about how messed up the system is and especially in this respect.
Yeah, and thank you, Sam, for being such a great co-host.
Oh my gosh, stop. Thank you. If you're interested in reading Priya's full article or learning more about the flaws in our legal system, Check out the Flaw magazine at theflaw.org.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to check out the show notes. There'll be some awesome links and references there. And make sure to subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also check out flawschool.org for more content. Thank you all for listening and looking forward to talking at you in the future. Class is dismissed.